CBS News White House and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan is at Mar-a-Lago. She just left a news briefing with senior administration officials, and she is on the phone with us right now. Margaret, what can you tell us? Who was at this off-camera, on-the-record briefing, and what was said?
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, along with President Trump's Chief National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster, briefed the press, took questions, and we saw the Secretary of State speak extemporaneously, no notes, responding to reporters' questions, really laying out the justification for the president's decision to carry out this extremely limited, extremely targeted strike in Syria, and making clear, he said, that this is not about a declaration of anything more than the president takes it seriously and is willing to take decisive action when there is a violation of an agreement. Remember that Russia promised to help get Syria, the Assad regime, to hand over all of its chemical weapons back in 2013. That Obama-era deal was hailed as a diplomatic way out of military conflict at the time. The Nobel Peace Prize was actually awarded to the agency that helped to arrange for the removal of those chemical weapons, but clearly sarin gas stockpiles still exist in Syria. And because of that, the Secretary of State said it is clear that Russia is either complicit in these attacks or totally incompetent in its ability to guarantee that Bashar al-Assad doesn't continue to carry out chemical weapons. With that in mind, the United States decided to carry out this targeted attack to hit the airfield where this plane took off from that dropped the sarin gas on this village in northern Syria. Also, we learned in this briefing, they confirmed with a high degree of confidence that sarin gas was also used in 3 previous attacks over the past week and a half or so in Syria. Those are attacks that we've been tracking, but it looked at the time like a mix of sarin gas or reports of other agents, and tonight we learned sarin gas, the United States believes, was used in those attacks as well.
Margaret, we know that you're down there in Mar-a-Lago with the president because the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is there for a 2-day visit. Any indication if the Chinese president was informed before this attack took place?
I repeatedly asked that question of Secretary Tillerson, and he did not answer it. And he didn't answer it when another reporter put it to him as well. Perhaps you can read into the decision not to respond. But what we know is Secretary Tillerson did say, don't extrapolate from this one strike any greater policy when it comes to Syria. However, he did acknowledge, as the General McMaster, that they believe the message here is that the U.S. is willing to take military action. The credible threat of military force is back on the table. In this case, it was to respond to the use of a chemical agent. Clearly, China's President Xi Jinping goes to bed with North Korea on his mind, the growing nuclear threat there. So to take this action with the Chinese president in town is definitely viewed in a certain context in regard to that growing threat in Asia. But we don't know whether the Chinese president received the diplomatic nicety of a briefing before the president told the rest of the world what he had just decided to do.
Margaret, give us some context here, because Secretary of State Tillerson has not talked to reporters in this way, from what I understand, very much at all. What was this like, this briefing like? You said that the Secretary was speaking without notes, extemporaneously.
Well, this is what's so interesting. I mean, I've traveled with multiple Secretary of States. I've followed them through conflicts, diplomatic agreements, and I've never seen a Secretary of State like Rex Tillerson before, who really shies away from the press, does not believe in public diplomacy, will not sit for interviews, and will not talk and respond to questions put to him by reporters. And tonight, we saw a very different Rex Tillerson than what he has shown himself to be since he joined the Trump cabinet. Tonight, he broke that mold. He did respond to questions. He spoke extemporaneously. He didn't have notes in front of him. They weren't scripted remarks. And he was able to put in context not just this strike, but be able to speak in terms of historic precedent, going back saying, look, since 2013, he said there had been 50 chemical weapons attacks in Syria, showing that there had been consistent violation of that deal that the Obama administration had helped to broker. and saying that, look, the past administration overlooked these small-scale attacks. We are not willing to do so. So he articulated what we've heard so far in terms of any kind of Trump administration doctrine or policy. We frankly haven't heard one from the president before. We don't know when you carry out a strike and you want to send a message and you don't explain what that message is, it leaves some around the world scratching their heads as to what U.S. foreign policy is about. And tonight, Rex Tillerson started to outline that, saying, at least when it comes to making a commitment and you break it, that's a problem for us. But we also heard here that there was no advance warning given to Vladimir Putin, but Russia did receive enough advance notice to move its personnel out of those airfields that were hit, and that there was no deconfliction there. So this wasn't something that totally blindsided Russia by any means. U.S. allies in the region were also given the heads up. Most of that would have come through the Department of Defense, but as well as the Office of the Secretary of State.
Margaret, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So did the U.S. officials tell you tonight that the Russians believe that there were no personnel killed in this attack, or is it just too early to ascertain that?
They wouldn't speak to that. They pointed to H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor to the President, said he wanted to leave the specifics to the Pentagon, where they are doing extensive briefings on the after-action report and specifically what they see on the ground. But he did make the point to say that measures were taken to help protect some of the foreign nationals who are on bases there. So there was an eye towards limiting the civilian casualties or the casualties related to those contractors or other foreign nationals who might have been on those Syrian bases.
Margaret, I'm just curious about whether or not anything was discussed regarding the timing of the president's decision itself, because we heard the very forceful words from the president talking about lines being crossed in his mind when he was asked in the Rose Garden about that as he stood side by side with King Abdullah. He made very clear that for him there seemed to have been a change, and in fact he talked about that, seeing these images and the horrific images in the aftermath of this attack. Do we know what the time frame was? Had a decision been made at that point, or is this all something that transpired within just the last 12 hours, 5 hours? Do we have a sense of that?
Well, from the briefing we just had, which didn't, in many ways, those very specific questions you laid out, we put to both of our briefers and they didn't directly answer them. But what we can gather from the timeline they did sketch out, the final decision was made today, but early on, General McMaster said, President Trump said, of the 3 options presented to him, he only said go forward with 2 of them, and that inaction was not an option under consideration here. So it sounds like they had gathered multiple military options for the president to review, and this final action is the one that he chose to go with. It sounded like today. I know one of my colleagues at the White House right now, Jackie Almani, was reporting that the vice president was actually in the Situation Room during these strikes, also monitoring it. We heard from General McMaster that this was a full meeting of the National Security Council on 2 occasions where they looked through these options and really talked through it. But I do want to also point out, Elaine, when we talk about the president's emotional response, the message was supposed to be sent here. This wasn't emotion, this was strategic. But the president repeatedly, in what he has actually said about these strikes, is that what changed his mind was those images of beautiful babies, babies and children murdered by this poison gas. And the point was raised in this briefing to the Secretary of State, well, does the president now want to revisit his decision to block those Syrians from America? Remember, those Syrian civilians, many of whom have become refugees, if the president's travel ban goes through, would not be allowed to enter the United States of America. So it was an interesting question in this context to say, now that the president has felt himself so moved by the plight of those people, those civilians in Syria, does that change his mind about whether he will give refuge to any of those individuals here in the U.S.? And they just simply said, that's not even how we're connecting the dots. We're not talking about that at this time. So we'll see if we see any further evolution or extrapolation from what happened today into President Trump's thinking on other big national security issues.
And was there anything more, Margaret? You talked about the fact that the Chinese president is there and the North Korea threat is ever looming, and it's very clear this administration wants some sort of help from the Chinese in dealing with North Korea. Do they believe that this might somehow push the Chinese to be more aggressive on the North Korean front?
Well, they wouldn't go that far in this briefing, but I know from speaking to other U.S. officials who are very involved with national security that privately they're increasingly frustrated with both Russia and with China, and calling them out by name, saying that they continue to shield the Assad regime, a war criminal, when he goes through with chemical weapons attacks, when they go to the UN Security Council and prevent any kind of action being taken against Syria, that's a problem for the United States. You can easily make that parallel to North Korea. When you look at Kim Jong-un, the very mercurial leader there, whose regime has been blamed with so many war crimes for just horrible crimes against his own people in terms of starvation and human rights abuses, that message is also being sent there, that when you shield bad actors, we will blame you as well when they take bad action. So you see a foreign policy slowly coming into focus here, but I have to say, the national security team is still trying to hammer it out. You can't walk away from today and say we know what a Trump doctrine is, but we know that they at least want to be taken seriously when they threaten the use of military force.
All right, Margaret Brennan at Mar-a-Lago with the president. Margaret, thank you very much.
Thank you.